I want to thank you for being here. We don't want to forget, however, those who are tuned in online. We appreciate your attendance virtually as well. We understand that there are still many who are struggling with the decision to get out and to deal with many of the issues that they're being faced with today. I'd like to commend the gentlemen upstairs. Yesterday they live streamed the wedding, and I think they had 50-plus viewers. Incidentally, a far greater reach than my sermons get. I don't know what that means, but anyway, it's an amazing thing that they can do. There were people in California who were in the family of the bride who were able to watch the wedding, who would not have been able to necessarily do so otherwise, especially not live. And so I think it's amazing what we can do and what the gentlemen who are in charge of that do. And it's just another example of the many wonderful things we have. Story is told of two hunters who go to Canada to moose hunt. And the only way to get to the outer reaches of where they're moose hunting is by plane. And so they get on a small prop plane and they fly out into the middle of nowhere in Canada, and they have a good day. They kill 4 moose. Four of them. And they go to load back on the plane, and the pilot says, "Look, payload of this plane allows, I can only take 2 moose back." And the 2 hunters say, no. We were here last year, and we had 4 moose on a plane just like this. And so the pilot says, no. Well, finally, they insist, and they load 4 moose on the plane, and the pilot and the 2 hunters. Well, they don't get very far, and the plane is struggling, and finally, the plane crashes. The only survivors are the 2 hunters. And so they scramble. They say, and one of them turns to the other and says, I wonder where we are. And the other hunter says, I think this is about the place we crashed last year. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. There are a lot of people who practice dating insanely. They engage in the behaviors that are almost proven over time to ensure failure in relationships. And yet those same mistakes and those same pitfalls people fall into time and time again. I was thinking about Cole and Ashley's wedding, and at the time that I was preparing my sermon, they were in the auditorium and in the building, and they were messing around, and I had just about decided to preach on this, and that just sort of solidified it. I said, you know, because of this event and because maybe marriage is going to be on many of our minds, let's talk about this. How not to choose a spouse. And what we're going to do this morning is we're going to notice 3 methods that people have used over the years and unfortunately will continue to use that almost inevitably ensure failure, ultimate failure, in choosing the kind of mate that can help us get to heaven. Because that's the goal after all, isn't it? To find people with whom we can spend eternity, with whom we can rear families who will be faithful to God and be in heaven when our lives on this earth are over. And our main text this morning is going to be 1 Samuel chapter 25. So you can open your Bibles this morning to 1 Samuel 25, and there you will find a description of the event surrounding Nabal and Abigail. Nabal and Abigail. And I want to point out from the outset that this marriage doesn't look like the marriages that we enter into today, at least not in the way that it's begun, because in all likelihood this was an arranged marriage. The wife's parents, Abigail's parents, would have arranged this marriage based on various factors that were largely out of Abigail's control. And so I can't blame Abigail for being in the circumstance in which she finds herself. You and I don't have that excuse. We enter into our relationships for the most part willingly, eyes open, of our own accord, of our own volition. And so you and I can avoid some of the pitfalls that we see illustrated by the relationship between Nabal and Abigail. Let me sort of set the stage for what's happening. David is on the run from Saul, and David and his company have grown famished They're tired, they're hungry, they're thirsty. And they enter into an area where Nabal has a large flock. And he has many servants, and he has great provisions. And so David sends messengers to Nabal and requests food and preparations to be made to provide for David and his company. And Nabal refuses. In the process of time, Abigail, his wife, hears about Nabal's refusal. And she sets out to do damage control. She meets with David and she smooths things over. And it comes to pass that Nabal grows ill and he dies as punishment from God for his behavior in this circumstance. So there's sort of the long and short of what happens. But I want to zero in on Nabal's character, Abigail's character, how these two interact within this marital relationship. And what we're going to do is we're going to see three methods illustrated that we don't need to use to find a spouse. The first method I'll describe as the yard sale method. I don't know if y'all do what my wife and I do, but you frequent yard sales and you're hoping to find that diamond in the rough, right? There's even a show about this now. And a flea market flip. And what they do is they have so much money allotted and they have to find these worn out pieces of furniture and they have to create from them things that they can resell and make a profit off of, and the one who makes the most profit wins. Okay? So maybe you go to yard sales and you're looking for that rundown piece of furniture that you can repurpose, that you can, maybe a chair that you can reupholster or something that you can refinish and you can make it better than it was. You're looking for a diamond in the rough. That's great when you're trying to find furniture. Not so much when you're trying to find a spouse with whom to spend the rest of your life, to help you get to heaven, to rear a family. But what I've noticed in talking with people young and old alike is that often, and this most often affects the mindset of women, right? They find this man and this man is rough and this man is not what he needs to be, but that woman is convinced that she can polish him up and she can make him what she wants him to be. Maybe there are men who see this woman and for whatever reason they believe that they can take this woman who is not at all what she needs to be and what he needs her to be, and he can shape her and turn her into what he wants her to be. Well, we see sort of that idea in 1 Samuel chapter 25. We're introduced to Nabal, and I want you to listen to the description of Nabal and of Abigail. Now, the name of the man was Nabal. We'll notice what that means in just a moment. And the name of his wife, Abigail, and she was a woman, notice this description, of good understanding. I believe the ESV says of discernment. And it also says that she was of a beautiful countenance. I mean, what more could you ask for in a woman? She's smart, she's wise, she's beautiful. Everything that you would want in a woman. And Nabal, the man, is described as churlish and evil in his doings. And he was the house of Caleb. You talk about an unmatched couple, an improperly matched couple. You've got a woman who is of good understanding and beautiful, and you've got a man who is evil and churlish. Well, what does churlish and evil mean? The word churlish means harsh. This is a man who is the opposite of Abigail. He's not of good understanding, of good discernment. He is harsh. The word evil there is translated in the ESV as badly behaved. This is a man who doesn't live as he ought to, who is not wise, who is harsh and mean, and he's married to a beautiful, wise, intelligent woman. Certainly not the type of relationship that we would have advised her to enter into. And my question as I read this is, when was Nabal like this? Do you think he was like this before they got married? I don't think people just overnight become evil and churlish in all their doings. Nabal was likely like this beforehand. And so my question is, now I know they were in an arranged marriage, but maybe you know people like this today. So unmatched from a character standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint. And you say, how did you get into this situation when you knew who they were? Well, so often it's because I thought that I could change him. right? I thought that I could make him or her into what they needed to be and what I needed them to be. I was certain that they would change. Nabal was what he was before they married, and he was what he was after they were married. But if I had $1 for every time I've heard this, but people can change. Well, yes, they can. They absolutely can change. I was preaching a sermon series on marriage in a gospel meeting, and it was in the opening lesson, the Bible class lesson on Sunday morning, that I preached about our need to try to find people, to marry people who can help us get to heaven. Marry Christians, those of like precious faith. And afterwards, a woman confronted me and said, "I'll have you know that my husband was not a Christian when we married, and now he is, and we're both faithful to God." That's wonderful. That's great. Is that the exception, or is that the rule? You see, and that's what I'm trying to get across this morning. Maybe you're here this morning and you entered into a marriage relationship and you or your spouse were not faithful to God, and you've grown and you've changed, and people do change on occasion. But let me ask you 3 questions in follow-up. Number 1, how often do people really change? Now, yes, certainly it happens, and people can change their lives drastically, and we know of examples of that. But if we're looking to do that which gives us the greatest chance for success, really ask yourself, how often does that really happen? Number 2, to what extent do people really change? It's very rare in my experience that people make a complete 180 in who they are before marriage and who they are after the marriage. In fact, usually the guy and the girl are trying hard to be somebody different until they get married. And it's not until about that 1st or 2nd year that you start to really realize who you married. So if they're not who they need to be before the marriage, what's the likelihood that they're going to change to such a degree that they will then become who you need them to be? And let me ask you this. This is the question that you really need to answer. Normally I say you and I, but I've already answered it. This is the question you really need to answer. If my potential spouse doesn't change a lick, can I see myself spending the rest of my life with them? If this old codger never becomes anything but an old codger, and if this fellow, this lady who doesn't live as she ought to, who doesn't have any desire to follow God in the way the Bible directs, who doesn't care about this or that, if that person never changes and is always what they are now, will our relationship be what God wants it to be? I don't know how many people really stop and consider it that way. They always think, well, if I can change him, it'll be great. But what if you don't? What if you marry Nabal and 10 years from now he's still Nabal? What are you going to do then? There's a passage in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14. Be you not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Now this doesn't specifically have to do with marriage. It goes on to say, for what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness? Communion hath light with darkness. It can apply to business dealings. It can apply to all sorts of aspects in our lives. If you were at the wedding, or if you watched it live or later through the stream and you saw the little video they put out at the end, I thought that was pretty interesting. And what Ashley said about Cole was, you know, the thing that really impressed me was he came to church by himself, without his family, without his friends, and he demonstrated his dedication to God, and that was what was most important to me, and that's the very first thing that I noticed. Well, that's great. That's how it ought to be. And she was concerned about that. He was concerned about that, and therefore that was the basis for their relationship. But so many times people are unequally yoked. Now you say, what does that mean? I've got an illustration. All right. Here is what it means to be equally yoked. And don't you love those oxen, the detail on those oxen? Isn't that amazing? Notice this cart is going to go wherever it needs to go because you've got 2 animals pulling in the same direction. Okay? And when one turns, the other turns. When the one goes straight, the other goes straight. And they are fully invested in taking this cart the direction it needs to go. They are equally yoked. But have you ever seen this in a marriage relationship? How far is that cart going to go? I'd hate to be the one driving those animals. I mean, you're not going to go anywhere. All that's going to happen is probably the cart and everything on it's going to be destroyed. 2 people pulling in the exact opposite direction. One going forward, one going backwards, going to cause nothing but problems. Well, you say, well, our relationship isn't that bad. Maybe it looks more like that. How far are you going to get in your relationship even looking like that? You know, we're pulling in similar directions, but they're kind of pulling to the right and I'm kind of pulling to the left. Well, we can ignore all those things. Well, maybe you can ignore them for a while. But what's happening to your relationship? Those things that are the important life issues that keep pulling you apart, how in the world can your marriage move forward? Now, am I saying you need to find somebody exactly like you? Goodness, no. My wife and I, in many respects, are polar opposites. But there are things that are deal breakers, right? That when we decided we were going to spend the rest of our life together, there were fundamental, foundational things upon which everything else would have to rest. And all of the differences had to be moderated by those foundational similarities. What we thought about the world, what we thought about God, how we wanted to rear our children, what we thought about these basic aspects of life. Those are the things in which we are equally yoked. So if you look at your relationship, if you're not married and you're dating, or if you're looking for a potential spouse, ask yourself, what does my relationship look like? And which one gives me the best chance to be in heaven with that person when our lives are over? You see, that is the yard sale method. We've next got the undercover agent method. Undercover agent goes deep cover. They pretend to be somebody they're not. And everybody that's around them believes they are this certain person, but that's not at all who they are because they're just acting. They're just an agent. And everybody around them is mistaken about who they really are because they're really somebody else. Do you know anybody in a relationship like that where everybody who knows this person believes they're not a good person? The only person who believes differently is the one who's dating them. Have you ever had a situation where all of your friends said, this person is no good for you? Look at all of the things that they're doing that are bad for you, and you refuse to see it. Why? Because you're wearing what we call rose-colored glasses, right? And you believe that everybody is mistaken about this person but you. Be careful of the undercover agent method of choosing a spouse. Now, I've heard this, we see this, illustrated in 1 Samuel 25. Abigail finally comes and meets David, and David is angry. David says, look, this Nabal fellow, he's not going to live very long. Okay? And Abigail comes to smooth things over. And notice what she leads off with in verse 25. Let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial. To call somebody a man of Belial is to call him the lowest of low, right? He is a wicked man. And then notice what she says. For as his name is, so is he. Well, what does Nabal mean? Nabal means fool. And she says, look, he is what his name implies. What you think he is, he is. It seems like such a simple lesson, but that really is a great reminder for those of you who might be seeking spouses today. If everyone that you trust believes the person you're dating is not good for your soul, is not good for your future, you might need to take a step back. But they just don't know them like I do. You ever said that? I've said that before. Not about Danielle, but about other girls that I dated. My friends said, look, she's not treating you right, and we know it. No, there's no way. You just don't know her the way that I know her. Famous last words. You need to ask yourself the question, what about objective people? That is, people who have my best interest at heart, who aren't in love with this person. What do they think about them and their relationship to me? If objective people who have my best interest at heart don't like this person, then what are the chances that I need to re-examine them more objectively? Now, I understand your daddy probably won't like the guy that you bring home. Okay? I understand that. He's not objective. I recognize there will be a time that Sidney Jane will bring some sorry guy home, and I'll hate his guts the moment I lay eyes on him. But I hope that I recognize whether that person can help my daughter get to heaven or not. And if he can, I hope I'm supportive in the way that I need to be supportive. But there are inevitably people in your lives who don't have a dog in the hunt, so to speak. And they can look at this person and say, this person is not right for you. They will not help you with the things that are the most important in your life. When your parents sit down with you and objectively tell you, this person, probably not right for you, it might be a good idea to listen. When your friends that you've trusted for years say the same thing, it might be a good idea to listen. And it probably is the case that you see the very same flaws that they see, but you refuse to really acknowledge them. You excuse them. Listen, if you keep having to make excuse for your spouse-to-be, for the one that you're dating, take a step back and try to look at it objectively. Do you want to have to make excuses for that person the rest of your life? Do you want to have to do that? Do you want to have to deal with the same problems you're dealing with now for the rest of your life and constantly excusing them? In the New Testament, Jesus states it very simply. You shall know them by their fruits. How many people who are in relationships, they're dating an apple tree and they want everybody to believe that it's a tree full of oranges. And they're convinced that it's oranges, and everybody tells them it's apples, and they just will not be convinced. Jesus says, men don't gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles. He says every good tree brings forth good fruit, every corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. Now, have parents ever been wrong about significant others? Absolutely. Absolutely. Daddies have cleaned their shotguns and run off a man who turned out to be a really good guy. It's happened. And I recognize that. Again, if everybody in our life looks at somebody and says, you might want to reconsider, and those people are objective and they have your best interest at heart, maybe it's time to examine the fruit on the tree a little bit more closely. Try not to use the undercover agent method to find a spouse. Number 3, the used car method. My father would not allow me. I was 17 years old. I'd had a Mustang for a few years in high school, and it was time for me to go off to college. I needed something a little more reliable. It was an older Mustang. And I was in love with the 4-wheel drive truck. It was used. It was within my price range, and it was on the lot, and I was in love with it, and that's what I wanted. And my dad would not let me get it because it was used. My dad was of the opinion that a used vehicle, you were buying someone else's problems. I heard that so many times. You're buying somebody else's problems, somebody else's problems. He was convinced that you were not able to really see the problems that underlay that beautiful exterior. And so he forced me to buy something smaller and less cool because it was new, right? He didn't trust his eyes with the used vehicle. Now, he'd probably been burned before. He'd probably bought some used car that looked great but turned out to be a lemon. And we have many more advanced options now, don't we? We didn't have the Carfax back then where you could just print out a report of all the accidents it had had. You know, you couldn't search the VIN online and find all of the problems that had been with this vehicle, whether it had been in a flood or whatever else. And so my father may have had some wisdom in saying, look, if you don't know the history of the vehicle, don't buy it. But you know, so often we approach finding a mate, and all we do is we go to the lot and we kick the tires a few times and we look around at the paint and we say, yep, that's the one I want. We're not worried about what's really inside. We buy it based on the used car method, based only or mostly on external factors. Let's look at Nabal again. Why did Abigail's parents hook her up with Nabal? Why do you think? I don't know for sure, but I've got a pretty good idea. 1 Samuel 25:2. Here's who Nabal is. There was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel, and the man was very great. And he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. I can imagine Abigail's dad cleaning his shotgun on the front porch, ready to shoot old Nabal. And then he says, oh, he's rich. Never mind. And he puts his shotgun aside. Why would Abigail's parents think that? Well, you know, there was a dowry in there somewhere, wasn't there? They were going to get money from Nabal's family and from Nabal. And so all they were concerned about was how rich and powerful he was. That's all they concerned themselves with. They didn't care what kind of person he was. They didn't care whether he would treat their daughter right. They were in it for the external factors. And unfortunately, we see, and I see in the lives of our young people, this same attitude when choosing a spouse. But, you say, he or she so beautiful, so talented, so handsome, so rich. And shouldn't that make up for all of the other problems? Now, people have misunderstood when I've said this. So you're telling me I need to find someone who I'm not attracted to? No, I'm not saying that at all. But maybe, just maybe, there's somebody in the world that you are both attracted to and can help you get to heaven. Let me ask you, parents. If your boy or girl brought home a young man or a young woman who maybe you didn't find as attractive as what you had hoped they would bring home, but they were faithful to God, how would you respond? How would you respond? You know, what are our grandkids going to look like? You know, are they going to look like him or her? I don't know. Or are you going to say, hey, they have chosen wisely? Do you know those couples that don't seem to fit looks-wise? Handsome man, woman who maybe not quite as much, or beautiful girl. This happens most often, right? Beautiful girl and a guy who looks like he's off the back of a milk carton. You know, and you're like, how do those two people fit together? I wonder if they chose based on a different criteria than most of the rest of us do. You know, some of us get lucky. We choose based on looks or external factors, and we happen to find somebody worthwhile. But is that the exception? Or is that the rule? How many internal flaws are you willing to forgive because they're beautiful? Because they're rich? Because they're talented? And in 10 or 15 years, when they are still Nabal, how happy and how satisfied will you be in your marriage relationship then? See, by what method do we choose? What will you be left with when their beauty fades, when their money's gone? Will you be left with Nabal, a churlish and evil man in all his doings? Ask yourself the question, why do celebrities break up so much? If the external is the most important thing, don't they have it? They've got money, they've got fame, they've got beauty. And yet they're miserable, and you can tell it in their lives, in their marriages, in their relationships. Miserable. Why? Because it's all external. Because what's inside becomes less important and less valuable. And this morning we talked about David as a type for Christ, and we mentioned 1 Corinthians chapter 16, in which Samuel went to choose the next king. And Jesse paraded all of his strapping, beautiful, handsome sons in front of Samuel, and God said, those aren't the ones. And then He says, here's how I know. Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I've refused him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And oh, that we did that more when we were seeking the person that can help or hurt our spiritual lives. The mother and father or father of our children. The one with whom we'll spend the rest of our lives. What method do we use to seek a spouse? So that's how not to choose a spouse. But I would be remiss if I left you there, right? That's what not to do. Okay, everybody have a nice day. So what can we do in seeking a spouse? What should be the methods that we use? Let me give you two as we conclude here this morning. Number one, the birds of a feather method. Your spouse will likely come from your circle of friends, the people you surround yourself with. I know this for a fact. Danielle was the beneficiary, and I was the beneficiary of her prior relationship. I met a girl who brought me to Christ, took me to church, set up a study with the preacher, and I became a New Testament Christian based on a previous girlfriend and my relationship. And when I began dating this girl, I was not a Christian. And I had lots of friends who were not Christians and didn't live the way that they should. And when they found out that I'd found a good, pretty girl that was going to church, you know what they said? Take me with you. Really? All the places that you go to find girls aren't good enough. You know what they knew? If I want a good girl, I need to go to a good place. Because the places they'd been going weren't footing the bill. And that always struck me. These guys who didn't care anything about religion knew that you go to a good place to find a good girl. See, who you surround yourself with is going to have a lot to do with the kinds of people you're brought in contact with. Now, many of you found your lifelong spouse, and they're great people, and it didn't happen at church. And I understand that. Not everybody's Cole and Ashley. I recognize that. You can meet good people at Walmart or the gas station or wherever else, Lowe's, or wherever else that might be. You know, it happens. But, again, if you want the best chance to find someone who can help you get to heaven, you need to practice the bird of a feather method. Birds of a feather stick together. As we think about that, certainly the Bible talks about that method. Think about the prodigal son. Now, we often get on to the prodigal son for taking his father's substance. But his daddy let him do that, didn't he? He said, "Give to me the portion of my goods which befalleth me." And that was not good. That was self-centered. But his father said, "Okay, I'll give it to you." What if his son had taken it and joined himself in the synagogue of the new place he went, around all of those good Jews? And he had found himself a good Jewish girl and used his father's inheritance to set up a good Jewish family that was faithful to God. What would his father's reaction have been? Good job. But what did the son do? He took that inheritance and he went and joined himself with the worst of the bunch. And he wasted his substance on riotous living. You see, it was as much about what he did with what he had, who he surrounded himself with. That helped in large part to determine who he became. I see it with young people who go off to college all the time. Young man goes off to college and he pledges a fraternity and he joins himself with a bunch of people who have a certain idea of what life ought to be. And he lives that kind of life, and he meets a girl who lives that kind of life, and they find themselves off the right track. Another young man goes off to college, and first thing he does, he finds a good church. And then he goes to the student center, and he surrounds himself with godly people there, and instead of going out to party like many of the rest of them do, he goes to the student center and he plays ping pong with the guys and the girls there who are all going to church with him and wanting to do right. And lo and behold, he finds a good Christian girl, and they get married, and they have a good Christian family. Was that on accident? Was that just coincidence? Or did he choose a path and surround himself with people that raised his likelihood of meeting a good person? Well, that's exactly what happened. Birds of a feather flock together. Number 2, the hand under the thigh method. Now, what in the world does that mean? Let me ask you this before I explain it. If you're single now, will you make the determination, will you make it right now, that there's going to be a certain standard of the type of person that I date? And my standard is going to include those foundational, fundamental things that can help me and him or her get to heaven, that can help us raise a godly family, that can help us be faithful to God. Let me tell you what I mean by the hand under the thigh method. Genesis chapter 24, Abraham said, it's time for Isaac to have a wife. And he called his highest servant to him, and he said, "You're going to promise me right now that you will not take for my son Isaac a woman from these people around us. I want you to go back to my homeland, and I want you to find somebody from my family, because I know their character. You promised me that." And so they did something really odd. The servant put his hand under Abraham's thigh. Why? Because that was a demonstration in those days of a covenant that was being drawn up between those two parties. And the servant said, "I promise that I will find the kind of girl that you want for your son Isaac." Now, we don't have Daddy's servant going and choosing our spouse for us like Abraham and Isaac did. It's up to us in our culture, in our society today. Are you going to make that determination? Will you make that covenant today? I am going to choose the kind of person who can help me get to heaven. If you can do that, then you can go a long way into finding the right kind of person. How not to choose a spouse. The yard sale method, the diamond in the rough. The used car method, only external factors. The undercover agent method, nobody knows them like I do. So many times those methods can lead to disaster. How about the hand under the thigh method? You make a determination right now, the kind of person that you want to spend the rest of your life with, and you don't settle for anything less. Do not settle for anything less. And of course, the bird of a feather method. How can you ensure that? How can you raise your chances of finding that? Surround yourself with godly people. Choose a path that will bring you in contact with that good person. Now, is this going to guarantee that your life and your marriage will turn out perfect? I wish it could. There are no 100% guarantees. And for every rule in life, so often in relationships, there seems to be an exception. I understand that. But today we're concerned with getting ourselves and our children, our grandchildren, in the best possible position to find someone with whom they can spend eternity in heaven. And I think if you follow these that we've laid out, if you avoid these that we avoid, then you can go a long way to ensuring that. This morning, are you married to Christ? If you're single here this morning, you know, who you marry is the second greatest decision in your life. You know the first? Becoming a Christian yourself. And you need to be the kind of person that good people are looking for. Maybe you're not a Christian today. Maybe you've looked at the New Testament and you've seen that every person who was saved through belief in Christ. But it wasn't dead faith, as James 2 described. It was faith that leads to obedience. Once I believe, I need to change my life through repentance. I need to confess the name of Christ publicly before witnesses. I need to be buried with Christ in baptism because that and that alone places us in Christ, Galatians 3:27. It makes me contact the blood of Christ, Romans 6:3 and 4, Acts 22:16. Maybe this morning, you need to do that. But maybe you're a Christian and you're a young person and you need to change your lifestyle so that you can find someone who can help you get to heaven. Maybe you've left the faith. Maybe you're already married and your marriage isn't what it should be because you're not what you should be. Maybe you're here this morning and it's not about marriage. Maybe it's about your relationship to God and you've let Him down through sin and you need to come back. Obey the gospel. Be restored as together we stand.